Right. Time to do a review of Stanley Kubrick's flip horror show 1971 dystopian science fiction movie, A Clockwork Orange, starring me, your humble narrator, Alex. No, actually, uh, Malcolm McDowell played Alex rather brilliantly, as he is in all of his roles. Um, and it also starred Warren Clark and Michael Tarn and James Rogers and Adrienne Corey and Patrick McGee and also Aubrey Morris, a rather interesting, and Dave Prowse too, um, an interesting dark dystopian fantasy about a future based on the 1968 novel by Anthony Burgess, a future where youth gangs basically have gone wild and commit all sorts of acts of horrible violence, and the police don't really seem to care. They're very blasé about the whole situation, um, and the government doesn't really seem to care either. Um, it's set in a dystopian England. It centers on the character of Alex DeLarge, played by Malcolm McDowell, who has his four droogs, which is from a Russian word which just means buddies. Um, Pete, Georgie, and Dim being really dim. And they hang out at the Korova Milk Bar and drink milk spiked with various drugs, Synthromesk, Drencrom, or others, which get them ready for quote unquote a bit of the old ultra violence. And then the first thing you see is they're now wearing masks and rather outrageous cod pieces, and they have canes and they beat the crap out of an old bum who's singing kind of a maudlin, sentimental song because Alex doesn't like that kind of music. He only likes classical music, particularly Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Um, and then they go on, they steal a car, and they drive off into the countryside and stop and do basically a home invasion, ironically, of a place called Home, and beat the crap out of Patrick McGee, who's a writer called Mr. Alexander, who's working on a novel called A Clockwork Orange. And they violently rape Adrienne Corey, who's his wife, while Alex is singing in the rain and dancing around and acting like Gene Kelly, which is a rather horrific scene. And then they drive off and go home. Alex lives in a kind of a rundown old council flat, and people have drawn graffiti over these classic Roman figures. And his mother and father are so oblivious to what he does that they think he goes to a job at night, and that he's just returning. Well, we see he's got a drawer full of stolen money and wallets and knives. And they had a brief run-in with another gang, also, I should mention, which is headed by his enemy, Billy. Uh, and they beat up a couple of them, and they steal away this girl that they were going to rape. And then Alex goes home, like I said, and he listens to Beethoven's Ninth and goes to sleep. The next day, he has a headache and decides he's not going into school, and tells his mom and dad, they're being sympathetic. And then his parole officer, P.J. Deltoid, played wonderfully by Aubrey Morris, is this slimy kind of impliedly perverted or gay character, comes over and he's wrestling with Alex, who's only dressed in his underwear. And he says, one day, little Alex, you're going to get into something so bad that, we heard that several members of Georgie's gang were ambulanced off during the night. And he says, well, I don't know anything about that. So one day you're going to get yourself into so much trouble that I won't be able to get you out of it. And that's kind of a precursor of what's going to come. Alex, meanwhile, since he's taken the day off, as it were, goes to a record shop where he picks up two kind of teeny bopper girls who are listening to rather insipid pop music of the time, things like groups called the Heaven 17 and Billy and the Bops, things like that. And he says, why don't you come over to my place? I've got a really terrific, stereo, and you can listen to your records there. And they agree, and they go home, and he basically seduces both of them to a very speeded up sequence of over which the William Tell Overture is played very quickly, which I thought was interesting. It's funny. They later he goes back to the Korova and meets his gang, And now they've decided that they want some new rules, that he's not allowed to make fun of Dim anymore, and that Georgie and Pete want more input into, what their activities are going to be. Well, Alex doesn't like this one little bit, and he responds by he pretends to agree, and then they're walking along the Thames embankment, and he slices Georgie's arm open. He knocks Pete into the Thames using his walking stick, and punches Dim in the face, and now he's like reestablished his leadership of the gang. They're going to do what he wants. After they have their usual milk at the Korova, Georgie and Pete suggest that they know an old woman who lives by herself with her cats and has a lot of money and valuable artwork in her house, and that they should use their usual home break-in techniques, and they can get a lot of money. So they go out there and they try to lure her using their typical ploy, which is to pretend that they've had an accident. And Alex says, "Oh, could I please use your telephone? My friend's terribly hurt. He's lying in the road bleeding." And she says, "Oh, no, I've heard about you gangs breaking in, using this phony stuff. Go away. And, you don't go away. I'm going to call the police." And they figure out a way to get in through an upper story window. They break in. Alex breaks in, I should say. And they beat the old woman up and start stealing her property, and she fights back, and Alex eventually hits her over the head with ironically, a sculpture that's meant to be an exaggeration of the male genitalia, and hits her on the head with it, and she's knocked out. Then as they're leaving, they hear the police starting to come. They hear a police siren, and Alex goes outside, and he's hit over the head with milk bottles by Georgie and Pete and Dim, who've betrayed him, and they leave him to be arrested. Now Aubrey Morris shows back up again and says, "See, I told you, now you've done it all, and now you're a murderer." He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "The old woman who you hit over the head, she died on the way to hospital, and now there's nothing he can do. He's going to go to jail, presumably for quite a long time." So we see Alex in jail, and he's trying to be a good prisoner, a model prisoner. He's sucked up to the quote-unquote prison Charlie, being the prison chaplain. That's a bit of a British joke, Charlie Chaplin. And he's, trying to be good, and he finds out about something, a new process called the Ludovico technique, and he wants to volunteer for it, even though the chaplain is against it. He says he doesn't like it. It has the potential is supposed to reform people for good. And Alex wants this basically just as a ploy he'll do anything to get out of prison. But so he goes ahead and volunteers. And at first, it doesn't seem bad. They take him to a separate facility. They inject him with some sort of a drug. And then they take him into a movie theater, and they clamp his eyes open with these metal clamps so that he can't shut them, and lubricate them so that they won't dry out. Malcolm McDowell was actually injured during this process. Those clamps were meant to be used lying down, not sitting up, but they wanted him in a sitting up position for the movie. And his corneas were actually scratched, I think, rather badly, but he did, in fact, recover. They show him these movies, and at first they're like movies of Nazi or atrocities and, people beating people up. And at first he's kind of amused. He likes them. And then slowly he starts feeling sick. And as the scenes get more and more violent, he becomes sicker and sicker, and he starts screaming, "Stop, stop, it's awful, please stop." And the prison officials say, "Yes, violence is awful, and that's what you have to learn. That's what we're trying to teach you." And he's becoming sick to the point where he needs to throw up, and they finally let him out. But the next day, they subject him to more and more of this. Finally, they do a review before a prison board where a man comes in. He's up on a stage, and Alex, he starts insulting Alex, saying, "You're just a little punk, and I hate you, and you're just a stupid, useless idiot." And Alex starts to fight back, and the guy kicks him in the ribs, punches him in the face. Alex can't do anything. He can't fight back. Every time he tries to fight back, he becomes physically, violently ill and can't do anything. And the next, they bring out a beautiful naked girl, and Alex tries to reach up towards her, and again, he starts feeling really, really ill, and he can't do anything. All he can do is lie at her feet. And the prison chaplain is disgusted, and he says this is awful, and they've robbed him of his free will. but they've declared that Alex is quote-unquote cured. And he's sent back to his house. He finds out that his mother and father have rented out his room to a boarder who is played by Dave Prowse, who later became famous for playing Darth Vader, although he didn't do Darth Vader's voice. They didn't want Darth Vader to have a Cockney accent, so James Earl Jones did the voice. But he says, oh, you're just a shame to your parents, and, you're a disgrace, and, they had to, he says, what happened to all my stuff? And they said, we had to sell it, to compensate the old woman's family for her murder. And so all his stuff is gone. His room is gone. He says, oh, I guess I'm not wanted anywhere. And even though his parents start crying, he storms out, and he has nowhere to go now. He's just sort of stumbling around the countryside, and he notices that like the graffiti has been cleaned up from his council flat, and things look a little bit more clean because there's a new government in. And he is accosted by his old droogie. Droog just is from a Russian word that means buddy, from a dim, and his old enemy, Billy. They've now become policemen, and they take him out to the countryside and beat the crap out of him. Of course, he can't fight back because the Ludovico technique won't let him. He manages to stumble into the home of, ironically, the very old writer whose wife he raped and who they beat in the first scene, and he doesn't recognize him. And, of course, he doesn't recognize Alex because they were wearing masks at the time that the attack took place. He says, oh, my God, you're that poor boy that the government subjected to this horrible Ludovico treatment, and, we're going to get you better, and we're going to, put you on the air and, show people what a horrible thing this is. And the writer and his friends start getting ready to, basically use Alex to push their own political agenda, which is to, down with the current government. And he tells him, go take a bath, and he draws a bath for him. And Alex absent-mindedly starts singing in the Rain, which is what he was singing when he raped Adrienne Corey, the writer's wife. And now the writer realizes who he has in his house. And he starts playing classical music, which they've also programmed him against because that was the one thing that he enjoyed. And Alex tries to kill himself by jumping out the window, but it doesn't work. He just breaks his leg. And he's taken to the hospital. And they arrest the writer and his friends as political subversives, and deprogram him, basically. In the end of the movie, Alex says, I'm myself again. That's a slight departure from the book, and I know that Burgess was not happy with it. In the book, I should say the original British version of the book, because the American version cut this chapter. There was a last chapter where Alex is still hanging out with a gang, but he's now 18, and he's starting to think maybe that he's had enough of this lifestyle. Pete is married, and he has a son. He no longer speaks in this made-up language called Nadsat, and Nadsat is just Russian for teen. He talks like a normal person, and Alex starts thinking that, maybe he'd like to be married and possibly have a son, and he's wondering if his son will have to go through the same things he did. That doesn't happen in the movie. In the movie, he's just, they show him a picture of a naked woman, and they play Beethoven's Ninth, and he's joyful, and, he says, I was myself again. What's the point of that? What's the moral point? Well, there are several. One is that, it was obviously an attack on these kind of teenage, juvenile delinquent, movies, which showed, teens being wild and violent, and took it to its extreme. What if they were, so violent that they committed murders and rapes and nobody, gave a damn? And then there's the whole question of free will. Is it better to turn somebody into basically a Pavlov's dog who can't commit violence, but also can't really have any responsibility for whether he or she is violent, or, to let them be themselves, even if that person is evil? And it's kind of an interesting conundrum. It's one of the darkest of the 1970s dystopian science fiction movies, and Kubrick himself was actually threatened when there were apparently a couple of quote-unquote copycat killings and or attacks that the people who perpetrated them claimed they got the idea from the movie. It was turned out later that wasn't true, but he banned the movie from being shown in England from 1973 all the way till 1992. So you could not get a copy on VHS. You could not show it in the theater. So that's how serious these people took it. It's a good movie. I recommend it. You can't really like it because it's so horribly violent, but it's well done and well crafted. And as with all of Kubrick's movies, it's a small masterpiece. And Malcolm McDowell is just terrific. He gives his absolutely best performance as Alex.